Hello, my name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with MySecurity Media. Welcome to our series. This is episode 2 of the Security and Risk Professional Insight series. We've been running this for about 4 years now. Previously, the Security Consultant Insight series, looking at advancements and applications for critical infrastructure protection and high security environments. We'll get underway with our panel. Thank you very much also to our sponsors, Curtin University, Security, and we'll be highlighting their Cyber Pavilion for the ICC 21st to the 23rd of August this year for Security Exhibition and Conference. Also EKA, Cyberlock and EVA with DAV Group, and proudly supported by ASIAL, the Australian Security Industry Association Limited, and ACES International Australian chapters. Just on some protocols, this session is being recorded. Audience questions are welcome, so fire them into the chat. Let us know where you're listening from as well. But ideally, I think if you can use the Q&A for any questions, and let us get into our discussion. And if you want us to cover off on anything specific, welcome to nominate that. And please keep it constructive and polite, obviously. We'll go for no more than 60 minutes. Last week we went for about 45 to 50 minutes, so we will have a hard stop at the top of the hour. I mentioned our sponsors. Thank you very much for those. We can't make these sessions possible without sponsorship and support. So very much thank you to those. This is episode 2 with a 7-member panel from across the domain, also nationally here in Australia. Last week, we focused on Canberra. We had Dr. Malcolm Davis, Jill Savage and Stephen Beaumont. I mentioned about 45-minute discussion. Malcolm gave a very good overview of the regional security environment, and at the time, Iran was sort of retaliating against Israel. So we're really in a live environment, and Jill and Stephen gave good sort of frameworks to what we're dealing with here in Australia. So this particular panel today will follow on that discussion. We've got Paul Riley, Director with Foreign Risk in Curtin University in Perth. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. And also in Perth, in fact, we're almost crossing over to Perth from Canberra this week. We've got Sydney and Perth represented. Dr. Shannon Ford, Senior Lecturer with Faculty of Humanities with Curtin University. Shannon, thanks for joining us. And Professor Sissel Hagdal-Jor, she's a Societal Security and Risk Management Professor with the University of Stavanger, Norway, but a visiting professor with Edith Cowan University in Perth. So Sissel, thank you very much for joining us. And Bryan de Caries, Chief Executive Officer with the Australian Security Industry Association Limited at ASIAL, and I've known Bryan for many years. So Bryan, thanks for joining us there in Sydney. We're going to get underway with an overview, maybe from Sissel. Sissel's really interesting, and Dr. Kevin Foster referred me to Sissel as a visiting professor at ECU. Sissel, maybe an introduction to some of the work you've been doing in Norway and how it relates back here in Australia, just to give us a sort of an international sort of flavour to this particular topic.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I think this is a very interesting and very important topic to discuss in every democracy, including Norway and Australia. So I will share with you some of the knowledge that I've done. I was a part of the Norwegian Defence Commission, and I also I'm currently doing a research project on the role of the Norwegian petroleum industry, which used to be like a commercial industry, but now has suddenly become like high security politics. So what is it that we are seeing at the moment? We are seeing an international security situation which is more unstable, dangerous, and competitive than it has been for a long time. And there is this ongoing struggle and battle between democratic countries, authoritarian countries, and this will last for a long time ahead. And we are in this new geopolitical area. And for us in Europe, it was really the Russian invasion in 2022 who really marked this new geopolitical area. Even though it has been occurring for a while, this was when war really was brought back on the table in Europe in many respects. And this area has really impacted the industry in Norway in many ways. Especially the sabotage on the Nord Stream really caused a lot of attention to how Norway had become now the greatest exporter of gas to Europe. And oil and gas is a very important factor in the Ukrainian war. And it's kind of an irony for Norway because we don't use the gas really ourselves, but we export it to other countries who need this. So it means that suddenly one of our critical infrastructure was becoming like a security political issue for other countries, not necessarily for us. And what happened was that we could see that the industry during 2022, there were almost 200 drone observations on the offshore installations. We had NATO ships coming, patrolling the offshore platforms, and we had armed military guards onshore. So it went almost like overnight from being like a commercial thing to becoming a highly security political thing. And I think this is really a good example on how it's how this will also show that in this new geopolitical area, the lines between the commercial interest and the state's interest are really blurring out. We are seeing a much more complex threat picture. And the distinctions that we like to have between the military and the civilian, the commercial and security is not there anymore. Digitalization has made us vulnerable also. And this means that we need new comprehensive strategies. We need strategies where you have authorities that can give a situational picture of what is going on, and they somehow need to be able to communicate this to the different sectors out there, and the different sectors have to take a responsibility, which is quite new for them. And this is also a situation where Australia suddenly can be in, either because you have a critical infrastructure that is critical to you, or maybe to another country like we experienced in Norway. So I would like to talk more about the private sector, because I think this new role is very complex, and it really challenged the boundaries between state interest and commercial interest in a whole new way that it has many dilemmas occurred with it.
Thanks, Cecile. And I think some of the key points you raised there is something Malcolm raised last session, was the pace of change and how things will change rapidly. We can't rely on sort of what's happening today and expect that same to be there tomorrow. Shannon, it's really great to have a European perspective as well, Cecile. I think we're a long way away from Europe, but it still impacts us here, and those discussions are here. Shannon, maybe any sort of follow-on commentary and your observations with the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. I'll just follow up on some of the bigger broad brush strokes, if you like, in terms of what we're doing. My role here at Curtin is I run the undergraduate bachelor's program in international relations, and also I'm the course coordinator for the Masters of International Relations and National Security. So we do a lot of thinking about how to prepare students to go and work in government in particular, but increasingly in the private sector as well. So one of the things that, having moved from Canberra to Perth, it was very noticeable is just how the skyline, literally the skyline is dominated by the big mining companies, the international companies as well, and just how much of an interest they have in what's happening in international politics, right? So there's this increasing interest. So certainly finding as an academic that students coming through, but also professionals looking to get a better understanding of what's happening in the world. Probably just a couple of observations. First up is over the last 20 years, really just seeing the shift away from a concern about terrorism and that being an all-encompassing kind of government concern to being really put on the back burner and seeing the sort of geopolitics coming back now. So, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about China a lot more, and of course those issues never went away. They just weren't quite the focus. And one of the observations is just having been a former China analyst myself, working in government, is just how people are. The last 10 years been quite surprised by China's behaviour when those of us who are working in that area weren't surprised at all about China's interest in Australia. So if you're talking about political influence, in a lot of ways, it's quite flattering that China's interested in us, but it's not surprising. I mean, they want to be a great power. they look at the US, they see what the US does, and they're looking at they're copying that, right? So we shouldn't be surprised by this behaviour, and I think the current government is getting it about right. We want to be the sort of in the conciliatory position between the US and China, rather than being a barrier against China necessarily. So that's one aspect. I think the other big trend is the challenges that are occurring to the post-World War II international order. So when we're talking about particularly the prohibition against war, we're really seeing that international norm, that settled international norm, being eroded, both in Ukraine, but also in Gaza as well. So this is one of the concerns, is that these sort of these rules, which have been so important over the last 50 to 70 years, really are being flouted. And I think that's a challenge to the system overall, I think, for all of us, and that's a real concern. And that's not, and it's something that younger people are very cognizant of too. It's quite noticeable here at the university, talking to young students. I mean, how upset and concerned they are about what's happening in Gaza and how much that's influencing their politics. And then the third main thing is, big trend is that the impact of emerging technology. So our lives have been fundamentally changed by what happens in cyber, and of course that's becoming a less secure space, and it's harder to get these settled norms that we need to make it a safe space. But we're seeing artificial intelligence coming online and having major impacts, and then things like robotics, issues of human enhancement, potentials for quantum computing as well. We're not sure what those things are going to do at all. So there's a lot of change coming down the line.
I think you're right, and that's a good point. Actually, there's a lot of change. We're still adapting to a lot already, but there's still a lot more to come down the line.
A lot more, yeah.
A lot more. Shannon, one thing in terms of the region and regional risk, do you look at regional risk in the Indo-Pacific? Do you have sort of a current take on that? I don't want to put you on notice.
No, that's right. No, it's not a problem at all. No, one of the units we had recently that we made some significant changes to was about Indo-Pacific security. So really thinking about the flashpoints primarily, right? So there's some of the major concerns, like Taiwan is the main concern, and what happens there. And again, I think it's very much in Australia's interest to make sure that that's not a conflict that goes hot. I think the some of the noise that's been coming out about taking a more aggressive stance, I think is concerning. I mean, certainly China's behaviour needs to be challenged, but it needs to be done in a way that doesn't inflame the situation. But North Korea, continues on being a potential flashpoint. Probably one of my major things I'm worried about. Talking about the Ukraine situation, it's obviously very important in terms of the international norm against aggression. Is that Ukraine is able to resist that Russian aggression? But I don't think we've talked a lot about the potential also for instability in Russia itself. Probably a worse situation than what we've got now is if we see some sort of breakup or balkanization of the Russian state, and then you've got various groups which are nuclear armed, and that becomes a much more unpredictable situation as well. So there's some of the concerns. I mean, there are some good stories too. I think Australia's, we forget that Australia's relationship has improved enormously with Indonesia. If you consider 25 years ago, we were on the verge of war with Indonesia. We now have a really strong relationship and productive relationship that's getting better all the time. So there are some good news stories too.
Another good point in terms of our relationship with ASEAN, Southeast Asia, has strengthened due to China. The likes of the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia in particular. I think that's a really good point that we have seen over that period. Bryan, to you, I think more of a sort of a national industry perspective and what you're grappling with, what you're seeing at the sort of the front line of the private security sector. We're seeing way more protests. We've had some recent, public space after some time, a declared terrorist attack in Sydney, but often involving knives and the like, as well as domestic violence and violence generally, street violence in Australia, and how this uncertainty globally impacts civilian populations and civilian mindsets, and that impacts on the frontline private security sector.
Yeah, but if you look at the private security industry, there's about 162,000 licensed security personnel. That's increased by about 10,000 over last year alone. So it continues to grow. So what we're seeing is a workforce that is greater than law enforcement and military forces combined. So it is growing. And whilst our members are essentially domestic focused, what we are seeing is certainly the conflict in Gaza has impacted, as you say, with protests. In September, October last year, the Prime Minister announced funding for extra security cameras and guarding services for faith-based places. We've seen the recent attack with a knife on a religious leader in Sydney, and again, everyone's wrapped up their security as a result of that. And obviously, we've seen some horrific incidents recently where the Bondi Junction, where these events are happening. So I think what we've seen is, even though things are happening 10, 15,000 miles away, there is a local impact. And it should also be noted that those 160,000 security personnel, a number of those are recent migrants to this country. For many, security is an entry-level role, security officer roles. So they come from a diversity of different backgrounds and countries. So again, it's an industry that's growing, and the demand for the services of the industry is growing, and that is in corporate applications, government. The pandemic was another example. There's a whole range of areas, both in terms of protective, electronic, physical, cyber. So, and we see that growth. It will continue to grow. So from an Asia point of view, probably the biggest challenge and the biggest national security threat is the fact that we have a complete patchwork of regulatory regimes that exist in this country. So that's probably the biggest vulnerability that we see, is that each jurisdiction has a slightly different way of regulating, which creates inherent vulnerabilities. So and getting regulators and government at a federal level and a state level to agree on this, they all will agree privately, but to get action has been quite frustratingly slow. And I think it's almost 25 years since we first raised this issue. So we are hopeful. We're getting closer, but we would like to see one national consistent approach, particularly as the security industry is fundamental to Australia's national security. You take away 200,000 people, and the technology and the protective services and the physical security and the cyber security, and you've got a major problem.
Yeah. We'll stay on the regulatory. I was going to come back to you and maybe some comments on it almost feels like a post 9/11 sort of mindset at the moment. Obviously a different context, but it's definitely a heightened sense of security and risk. But we'll stay on the regulatory side because, Paul, you're maybe introduce us to your role with Curtin University with Director of Foreign Risk for a university, and maybe what that role entails and sort of the regulations and compliance frameworks that you operate within.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me. I guess so. My role is new to Curtin and probably new to the sector as a whole, and largely it's in response to a lot of changes in the regulatory environment over the last 5 years. Largely, I believe, in response to the geopolitical changes or tensions that some of the speakers have referred to already. So my role really is about, firstly, probably building resilience within the community here to the risks of things like foreign interference, as well as compliance responsibility for the various pieces of legislation that have been developed over the last couple of years. So things such as the National Security Legislation and the Espionage and Foreign Interference Amendment from 2018. We have the Foreign Relations Act, which came into effect and applies to mostly state government and local government, but also the public university sector, where we have a responsibility to notify the federal government of specific types of foreign arrangements. We have the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, which really relates to individuals, but while we're looking at many of these areas of compliance and risk at the university, we assist staff in whether or not they have requirements to notify the government of particular arrangements they might be undertaking. And in addition, there's the Defence Trade Controls Act, which the Strategic Goods List has changed recently, as well as the recent amendment to the Defence Trade Control Act, where to bring us in line with the US legislation, which in line with AUKUS. There's the SOCI legislation, when there's various amendments or different tranches, which applies to the university sector as critical infrastructure. And obviously the ever-changing sanctions environment, both Australian autonomous sanctions, but also international sanctions, and how they impact on large global operations such as many universities. The universities sector have also had to respond to guidelines from the government, namely the University Foreign Interference Task Force guidelines, which were originally came out in 2019 and were updated in 2021, which are not legislation. Sorry, the lights just went out.
Okay. I was
All
wondering
went very dark.
went.
While not legislation, are strongly observed by the government in terms of trying to harden the environment to make sure those risks of foreign interference are managed in the university sector.
How do you go about managing all of that? That's your job to be across all of those. I think. Do you manage it via risk? Sounds like you almost need to be a lawyer to manage that. How do you manage that sort of compliance? Is it risk-based?
It is risk-based. So at Curtin, we have we've created a team, which again did not exist a few years ago, but with all those various pieces of legislation, Curtin very much saw the need to have subject matter expertise in all these various spaces. So I'm lucky enough to have quite a diverse skill set within the team here, everything from legal all the way through to marketing, because in addition to understanding the legislation and the legal risks, one of the main mitigations we see is education and awareness, which is really building resilience in the community through awareness. So we have a whole part of our team that is dedicated to just doing that, getting out into the different parts of the university, making them aware of, I guess, the current geopolitical environment for one, and then the risks that might stem from that, as well as individual and university responsibilities, trying to make sure that the university is aware that things such as the national security legislation has large provisions around reckless activities. So staff can quite easily get caught up in that legislation without having really any awareness of what it is they might be getting mixed up in. So really trying to raise that awareness in the community to, when staff or students do have issues or concerns, they're able to come to a one place at the university that can offer their advice and risk mitigation.
Right. Cecile, does that sound foreign to you, or does that sound pretty much what you would be expecting to see in Norway?
That sounds very familiar to me. We also have had university have, in particular, in the recent year, we have had several cases actually at Norwegian University that have kind of forced the university sector to become aware of foreign interference. We actually had a Russian spy who was arrested at one of the Norwegian universities. So for us, it's suddenly happening simultaneously with everything else I was talking about in the oil and gas industry. So for us, we had this, we really had this awakening that we're not just a peaceful corner in Europe. We really are, becoming, because we are of our location with the common border with Russia and the oil and gas industry. We have a lot of research, especially subsea technology, which is it's connected to the oil and gas industry, but it has this dual purpose. So a lot of the technology can also be used for military purposes. So we have had quite a lot of incidents actually in Norway. We had one case where Iranian got access to nuclear weapon, or not weapon, but nuclear development. So we had some cases that was really shocked the whole sector in a way, because this hasn't been an issue for us. We are new here, but we have worked a lot with it in recent years. So I think the situation is much better now than it used to be, but there still is a lot of problematic area connected to it. What do we do when we hire people? Who do we include in our research project? What do we do with information that we have that maybe should have been classified and so on? So it just causes a lot of new ethical dilemma that we have to deal with in the university sector.
Well, one of the key topics within this particular session was information sharing and information classification and how you can share that, because often almost at that sort of pre-war phase or war footing is you tend to, for your eyes only, you tend not to be sharing information, whereas often at sort of the public-private partnership sector, you do need to be sharing information. Shannon, the risk of that sort of foreign interference and the like, we've had ASIO come out and sort of confirm that it's happening at a wide scale and it has been happening for some time. Is that sort of an issue that you cover and how you present that maybe to your students?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously I worked in government in intelligence, so none of it's surprising to me. I mean, I think that the government has always been its job is to be across all the full range of issues, right? So if you're talking about China, there's always people who are thinking about China, regardless of what the story of the day is. So from that perspective, there's nothing particularly surprising. It's one of the most surprising things is just that, I mean, Mike Burgess is so forthcoming in whatever role he plays, whether it's ASD or at ASIO. He likes getting out to the media and making a splash. So, which is great as an academic. It's great, right? Because you actually find stuff out that you're pretty sure is happening anyway. But to have some sort of confirmation about what exactly is happening, and then be able to discuss it is quite useful. So look, none of this stuff is surprising. As I said, it's not surprising at all that China would be interested in Australia, given our relationship with the US.
I suppose maybe to come back to that, building that again, most of us are ex-government or we've been around along to understand that, but to build resilience within a corporation. And to embed that within a corporate culture for them to understand, for the private sector to understand. Do you find that's where the challenge is?
Yeah. Because I mean, coming to the university, for example, where the culture is about sharing information, that's part of what you're doing. There's a lot of naivety about these sorts of things. So if I come along and talk about things I take for granted about China's behaviour, people here just wouldn't believe it, right? So they would find it as a bit of a joke, something that you're not being serious. That wouldn't happen here, when in fact it has been happening. So there's been a gradual shift. Like people like Paul have been working hard there to educate the universities about China's particular focus on collecting technology intelligence, which is something that historically Western countries which have engaged in espionage haven't done, right? So they're sort of seen as off limits, right? So it's one of the great ironies that this intelligence is not recognised internationally in terms of international law, but there's certain conventions that if you step outside those, you're doing the wrong thing. So yeah, I think it's taken a bit, but I mean, gradually people, I think through legislation, are being forced to take this stuff seriously.
And Bryan, everything we've just sort of discussing, do you find that that's also changing? Even an organisation like ASIO, the traditional sort of guards, guns and gates don't cut it anymore? Are you finding from a corporate security setting, the skill sets are changing and the risks are needing to be adapted to quite quickly?
Well, I think on a number of fronts, the actual threat profile is changing. So obviously the services the industry provides has had to change. So I think that's just constantly evolving. We're seeing a whole range of things like digitization, use of technologies like AI to enhance and augment people. So I think the industry by definition has to keep changing, and it has. Just going back to that sort of information sharing, I think what we're seeing is that this has been an improvement, certainly with law enforcement agencies are gradually sharing a little bit more information with the industry. We start to see the CSC sharing more information. So typically it's been one way. Information has been shared with government, very little comes back. but we're starting to see a little bit more information sharing, which improves the decision making, because if you have that intelligence, then you can actually make appropriate responses. But I think we are seeing, as an industry, the role of the industry is shifting, and it's taking on more and more responsibilities and different types of role. So if you just look at the domestic violence space, the industry already plays a role in space in terms of monitoring and some of the devices. So potentially you may see it increased even more, because law enforcement don't have the capacity to do that. They haven't, have enough on their plates now. So a lot of these solutions are not going to be government agencies fulfilling the different needs. It's going to be the private sector coming in with solutions. So the industry has to be innovative and responsive to changing demand.
Do we have to just accept some of the gaps? I think maybe from Paul's perspective, one thing we find sort of in the private sort of physical security section, we all need to be licensed and the like, whereas cybersecurity professionals don't have any licensing requirements. So anyone can say that they're a cybersecurity professional. And then we have things like the SOCI Act, where critical infrastructure has to start to report. Do you find, even from your observations with that framework, that there are still gaps? And if there are gaps, how would they be, or how should they be treated?
Sorry, that was for me, Bryan. Yes, look, I think so. From my perspective, there is no licensing requirements in our sort of the foreign risk or the global risk space. We do within university have our sort of the physical security side, but yeah, having that licensing mechanism through cyber or indeed through these other avenues is not something that we've seen any indications the government might be moving towards. I think, as you say, a lot of people in this area have often, in the global risk space at least, have come from ex-government, so have that sort of background and qualification or experience. But when it comes to the cyberspace, I think the demands are so great in that area that anyone with some expertise in that space seems to be in high demand, regardless, from my perspective.
So Sal, your observations on your private security sector in Norway, how it may compare to Australia, or your observations while you've been here?
Norway has a much more like risk-based regulation system, I think, than Australia has, which is I think works good in a society with a high level of trust. It means that you have to be able to trust companies, trust universities, and so on, to actually do like real risk assessments. And so for us, we would start with looking at what is the value that we want to protect here? What is the critical parts of the critical infrastructure or the critical information part of it? And then assess like how do we protect this information and so on. And this risk-based framework is something that is a lot of industry is used to working in this framework. But what is new in this new geopolitical area is the national security part of it. Because even though industries, universities, the petroleum sector and so on, they are used to thinking risk-based, but they're not used to doing the whole risk assessment up until the national security level. So the consequence of this is that the intelligence services have to do much more outreach. They have to go out, they have to give information. The problem is also that those who work with intelligence and know the threat picture, they don't have the knowledge about, for example, the technology, the subsea technology in Norway, how can it be used for military purposes and so on. They don't understand the vulnerability in the petroleum sector, for example. So you need to have this conversation. That's why you need a cooperation between the traditionally defense and intelligence and private businesses and other sectors. But this is difficult, and it's a new situation. And I think especially for the private companies, in the end of the day, it's like the income that is the important part, and it really varies how much they actually prioritize to work with security. Some sectors are better than others, and also it has to do with the size of the company, I think. So yeah, this is challenging because it's the new geopolitical area, which requires a lot of new knowledge from on different levels in societies.
Well, I might open it up because one of the key aspects that came out from our last session was resilience and national resilience. Rory Metcalf from ANU is sort of calling for a sort of new attention to national security, national resilience. I'll just open up to the panel, maybe even back to Bryan. Just in what were some of the key shortfalls, say even from the front line, that we saw during the pandemic? Because I think when we saw sort of military being deployed at airports, it was the only sort of trigger that the federal government had. Whereas if we are in a conflict within our region, we won't have our defence personnel available to us, and we need to go to the next tier. So yeah, just some of the fallouts from the pandemic that you thought we do need to address for any future national emergency.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we saw with the pandemic was the need to respond very quickly. And I think what's pretty apparent is, I mean, security to this day is still not seen as a frontline responder, and yet they were very much on the front line. And you know, for example, some of them found it very difficult to go to fulfill their shifts as security officers at major critical infrastructure because they weren't allowed to move out of jurisdiction because they were not deemed to be a frontline or essential worker. So those are all issues that we need to respond to because they need to be fixed before the next major scenario. I think certainly with regards to, you know, potentially conflicts with neighbouring countries, security potentially has a role to play in terms of backfilling. You know, we're looking at 160, 180,000 personnel who could perform a role. But in order to do that, we do need to put in place consistent national standards. So it comes back to making sure we're all up to the same standard and making sure we put something in place now. You know, we've got the Olympics coming in 2032. You know, there'll be a significant security workforce required in Queensland, and there's no way that the Queensland state has enough existing security personnel, so they will be needed from all around the country. We need to start working now to put in place a structure that gives us the capability and the capacity to meet that demand. So I think the pandemic showed that the industry could respond, but the challenge is getting enough people and getting enough skilled people. So we need to put a lot of effort into professionalising and setting in place consistent standards across the whole country, not just one jurisdiction.
Great. And Shannon, your thoughts on a national resilience plan or national security strategy?
This might be a little bit controversial. I mean, we do have Curtin is starting up the new National Resilience and Security Centre here as well. So I should point that out. That's something new because of the issue in the interest in resilience. The controversial bit is I think governmentally we made a big mistake. I think in securitizing border policing. I mean, I think the issue of refugees is we put an enormous investment into an issue that was really a humanitarian problem, and I think that's taken away a lot of resources from what should be emergency responses. So I think all the attention and all the resourcing that's gone into basically managing the border, which is a humanitarian problem, should be focused on emergency services and emergency responses. And I think that's where really, if you're going to be developing a bureaucracy, developing a really significant capability, that's the future. I mean, whether it's climate change, whether it's responding to pandemics, any of these sorts of issues, I think that's where the national effort should be, if you like.
And it also needs to be at a relatively local level as well.
Yeah, all joined up. That's right.
Yeah, but do you not find now the framework that we have, the federated system of federal going through states to local, creates that challenge? Do you see a framework issue there?
A framework? Well, I'm not sure about a framework, but in terms of thinking as a national problem, right? So like we've done with the refugee issue, we've assumed that that's a an issue of major national security, or one of the top national security issues, I think that should be relegated, and I think that emergency response should be elevated to one of the top 3 or top 5 national security issues that we properly resource and have a national response to.
Well, look, what I might do is, we don't have any question. Oh, hang on. Do I have a question from the audience? I was about to say I've got a red dot there. I'm not a Teams specialist. So if you've got any questions, we're going to close with some closing comments. Here we go. Thank you, Kate. If we implement a national resilience strategy, how do we prioritise who gets help first? Potentially people who would be put off their day jobs, which might be supporting a small organisation, leaving them exposed. I don't know if anyone wants to handle that one, but how we manage that, a bit like the not so much the volunteers. Who's in the volunteers for the military? What are they called?
Reserves.
Reserves. Thank you. The reserves. Thank you. So if we do go to a war footing, a bit, I think we've seen this in Ukraine, right? All the reserves get pulled up. They're having to change their age limits for conscription and the like. A lot of those people may well leave. Have we thought about, and this came out of episode 1, of the interdependencies, the national aspects of the cross-sector impacts this has? A little bit like what Bryan mentioned with the pandemic. Frontline officers can't get to their jobs because we've locked down, and they're not classed in the right way. And I think what Kate's referring to there, how do you start to prioritise without that national strategy? Do we have a national framework that we would abide by, or as it comes down to the declaration of an emergency and then the government sort of kicks in with whatever's required, as we saw during the pandemic? They become a lot more agile only after the crisis has sort of been announced. Go, Paul.
Chris, I think the government is already doing this from my perspective. The Counter Foreign Interference Coordination Centre within Department of Home Affairs are very active in building resilience in the community, and I think they've taken, similar to what we have done, a risk-based approach. So trying to approach those parts of the community that are at greatest risk, build the resilience within those parts of the community first. So universities are obviously on that list. Certain parts, community groups are obviously on that list. Defence sector, critical infrastructure sector, all these sectors are, I guess, either at greater risk of interference, or the consequence of that interference obviously is significantly greater. So I think approaching it from that risk-based perspective is important, but also, as Shannon noted, things like Mike Burgess's public comments, I think, are incredibly helpful, which is shining a spotlight on some of these issues, making them real to the population without making it overly alarmist, but drawing attention to it, so that people do take it more seriously, do consider those risks, and do report issues and concerns when they appear, and feel comfortable in doing so, and have the trust in the system to do that. That's my perspective, Chris.
Right. Shannon? Prioritisation.
Probably just say that with the current system at the moment, your backstop is essentially your military. So you're talking about reservists. I mean, they're not volunteers; they're being paid to do it as well.
Sorry.
So and it's not a great option, right? So military, I mean, as much as they have the logistics, they're not really there for a surge capability, right? I think the problem is you really need specialists in emergency management to be doing it full time, right? So this is what I'm saying about the professionalization of emergency management. That's where we should be investing. I think investing government dollars into that area, because you want specialists who can do this stuff. Okay, because there's going to be issues.
It's capability building, and that takes time. That's right. Sort of my main concern is whether we're as agile as the environment is demanding us to be, and whether some things happen at pace that may need to be happening now rather than waiting. Bryan, I suppose any takeaways from this discussion from your perspective for the security industry? I see the security industry there as a front line. So that we saw 2 officers, one fatally stabbed in Bondi, and I think that gives, you know, an attack on a public place gives you the perspective of where the security sector is.
Yeah, I think the takeaway I would say is that the security industry is continuing to grow. It's a juggernaut which is going to keep growing. It's going to pervade every corner of society. And what we need to do is make sure we get it right. And the longer we put off trying to come up with this nationally consistent standard, the harder it's going to become. So we do need to take this by the horns and actually finally address it. We've skirted around it for almost 2 decades, and we need to get commitment, because when there is a major conflict, security potentially will have a significant role to play. So our view is the time is now, that we don't wait 20 years. We've already waited 20. Let's not wait another 20 years.
Well, and Cecile, any closing comments from you just on this?
Yes, I think to be able to build comprehensive security or resilience, it's important to acknowledge that there are a lot of different levels that play different roles in order to create a safe society. So, for example, on the individual levels in Scandinavia, we have had a lot of campaign trying to make citizens aware that if a war is coming or a natural disaster or whatever, it's your responsibility to actually have storage of food so you can take care of, and water and so on, just essential, so that people are aware that if something happened, the municipality and the state is actually going to take care of those who are vulnerable, not like the ordinary people. And I think this, like, building information and understanding the complex threat environment we are in is kind of essential in order to make a society resilient, because we are living in a very different world these days. Our most critical infrastructure, perhaps, is internet. It's not even owned by Australia. It's owned by foreign private companies. So we have to rethink, the whole infrastructure, the roles and everything, if you want to make what is good resilience in Australia.
Well, look, that was the main purpose of these 2 sessions, was just to have a look at sort of the requirements that we have, both for the private security, but also the landscape of a multi-region conflict, and whether that sort of conflict comes to our region as well. I think the takeaways that we've had on both sessions is, 1 is the pace of change, 2 is the interdependencies that we don't know. So the unknowns are still there. They're always going to be there. As well. One of the key sessions out of today was the regulatory frameworks, which I thought was great. Thank you very much for Paul and Bryan in that context as well. And Shannon, great insights there. I think with your opening sessions, just again on our relationships with Southeast Asia, I think it's something I hadn't really thought about as well, and how that's been strengthened over recent times. And Cecile, your insights from Norway and the European context, I think adds a valuable insight to this as well. So this session will be available with session 1. I'll try and make it available tomorrow. I should have my screen shared, but you would have seen on my shoulder here, drones, robotics and autonomous systems is going to be part of this. And I think, I was going to ask Bryan, we might have Bryan on again in terms of the security sector and what they're seeing frontline, security robotics, the use of drones. Shannon mentioned drones as well. No, I beg your pardon, Cecile mentioned drones and a sudden uptake in drone activity during times of conflict as well. I've definitely seen that in Ukraine also. Save the date. That's going to cross over. You should be seeing that. Let me go back. Hang on. I've got it delayed on mine. So save the date. Let me just go through some events that we've got coming up. The next session I'll release for those that have subscribed to this series. We will have one more webinar session before this, but we'll be in Melbourne for a live session on save the date on June 12th, and we'll have a security sector sundown, and we'll have a live panel session in Melbourne. And thank you to Diversified Communications, who will be hosting us there in Melbourne for that one. We'll be on the Sunshine Coast on the 3rd of July for Testing Tech in Paradise. This includes a tech tour, so anyone who's interested in getting up to the Sunshine Coast and Maroochydore, we'll have again a sundowner session and a panel session, as well as some pitch sessions across different technologies. So get along to that one. then the following day, so this is a good excuse to get up to Queensland for a holiday for a couple of days, we'll have a national launch opportunities and capabilities session with Griffith University in Brisbane as well. We might be doing a cyber security related breakfast in Maroochydore as well. So these sessions are available on the marketplace. Thank you very much again to our sponsors, our national sponsor, Curtin University, our series sponsors, Security, and they're now opening up, promoting their Cyber Pavilion at the ICC Sydney on 21st to 23rd of August. And thank you to Davcor Group with their EKA, Cyberlock and EVA access to security. And I mentioned ASIAL and ACES International as our supporting partners, and also the Australian Institute of Professional Intelligence Officers are also supporting this series. Thank you very much for attending. Save the date if you're going to be in Melbourne on the 12th of June. Thank you very much to our panel, very informative. Thank you to those comments as well. And this session will be available on demand. But pleasure meeting you all. And Bryan, thanks again. And I'll close this session off now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.